Hello and welcome to this week's video. Today it's just the one story, a little longer but still pretty short as stories go. I hope you will enjoy. The Imp at the Inn. It was near midnight by the time the inn's twinkling lights finally swam into view through the torrential rain. My pace quickened a fraction, regardless of the stabbing pains slicing up through my feet. When I came upon the door, I tightened the fastenings of my heavy, waterlogged cloak, took a deep breath, and went in. The inn's interior reflected the late hour, its only patrons pickled in drink and almost melting onto the floor in their stupor. The bartender floated somewhat aimlessly behind the bar, midway between stacking the last bar stools and preparing to haul out the unwanted sleepers. He must have heard my entry as the door snicked shut and deadened the sound of torrential rain that had roared on opening it, yet he ignored me. The sudden silence was soporific, and I swayed, steam rising from me like a heavy mist. I hid the moment of weakness by striding to the bar, careful to hold my heavy cloak shut, regardless of the heat pouring from flame lamps and a fire, burning merrily despite the late hour. "What'll you have, mister?" muttered the barman, with some reluctance colouring his voice. "An ale, a room, and no more questions," I replied, making my exhaustion painfully obvious. I carefully snaked my hands between the folds of my cloak and tossed down a few tarnished silver coins. My cloak shifted beneath me, for far too long after my hand had withdrawn, as though an impossible breeze had just whispered through the room. The barman's eyes narrowed, laced with suspicion. I gestured to the coins, worth twice the cost of the best room available, and coughed politely, hoping that since his attention was on my cloak, he would miss the panic in my eyes. "Do you want the ale in here, or—" "In my room, please," I cut in. "As you can see, I'm in dire need of a bed." He nodded sourly and gestured for me to follow. He cast a suspicious look back at the snoring drunks in the bar, despite none of them being compos mentis enough to even scratch their balls, before slouching up the stairs. I followed slowly, taking the steps one at a time, each footfall full of pain and steeped in languishing water. We reached the door to a room on the upper floor, one of the better ones, and the barman turned to me. "Here's your key." He fumbled for a moment with a huge iron key ring at his hip. I tightened my cloak to my chest and cursed each second it took for him to find it. "And I'll take your cloak, sir. It'll dry faster at the hearth." He reached out for the buttons at my neck as he spoke, catching me off guard in my tiredness. I drew back suddenly, too suddenly. There was a thud from beneath my cloak, and I stumbled, clutching it shut from the inside and nearly falling. "Bastard, just give me the key and piss off!" I snarled, snatching the key from his grasp and stumbling through the door, bent over like an old man. I snapped the door shut behind me and viciously locked it. I fell to my knees, throwing the cloak off my shoulders with a quiet curse, and dragging the prone figure who'd been hiding all along up into my arms. "Beach," I whispered. He was limp and sodden, with impish proportions and pale as death. I struggled to my feet, the small body heavier than a similarly sized boulder, and staggered to the bed. "Beach, talk to me." A small groan escaped his wet lips, and he mumbled something beyond my hearing. I put my ear to his mouth and squeezed his thin arm, straining to hear. "I bagsy the bed," he muttered. I snapped my head round to glare at the most impish grin I had ever set eyes on. "You bastard! I thought you—" I spluttered, with barely contained rage, but stopped at a wave of his hand. "Wake me when the ale arrives." "But—" He waved me off once again, dragging his sodden clothes off and throwing them onto the floor. I gasped and looked away, flushing and avoiding his eyes till he had wiggled his way under the thin cotton blankets and closed his eyes. "Well, I'm glad you're alive," I sighed, and leant my back up against the bed. My head rocked backwards, and the moment it hit the straw mattress, I was asleep. I had no idea how much time had passed when I was suddenly woken by a clattering knock on the door. I jerked my head forward and winced, my neck stiff and aching from being arched back for so long. "What?" I blurted, attempting to lurch to my feet and falling right back onto my arse, my feet chilled by the standing water in my boots, having lost all feeling. "You're ill, sir," came the quiet reply through the door. Clarity chased the sleepy haze from my mind, and I pulled myself up, silently wishing that I might have had the presence of mind to remove my wet clothes before I had fallen asleep. With only a moment's hesitation, I pulled the blanket up and over Beech's still frame, curled like a babe, and dragged the pillows about, hiding his presence from anyone peering in. I staggered over to the door, grabbing my cloak up from the floor as I went. It had left a puddle of muddy water where it had been dropped, dripping between the planks and darkening the old wood to near black. I twisted the heavy key in the lock and pulled the door open, an apologetic grin lining my tired face. "Sorry about earlier," I coughed, feeling a creeping awkwardness colouring my cheeks. "Only I was tired and—" The barman shuffled, glancing down the corridor, clearly impatient to get away. "Anyway," I shoved my cloak into his free arm and snatched the large pint of ale from his grip. "You can dry my cloak now." I chuckled nervously, staring at him for a moment too long, then slamming the door in his face. "Charismatic as always, Hayes," came Beech's muffled voice from the bed. "It's Hazel, and funnily enough, I didn't have a prepared script for that scenario," I snapped. He wriggled out from beneath the blankets where I had hidden him and gestured for me to hand him the ale. "You can't rely on a script for everything." I huffed and sat, tugging off my sodden boots and throwing them unceremoniously into the corner of the room. Beech took a long pull of the ale and sighed, licking the foam from his lips. I took his diminutive clothes from the floor and hung them over the curtain rail. I wasn't worried about anyone seeing them. It was night-time, and from a distance they could have passed for normal children's clothes, rather than the clothes of an illegal imp. I glared back at him, deep in the glass by now, and took the opportunity to remove the wettest of my own clothes and hang them up next to his. I didn't strip to my skin as he had done. Mine was a more modest countenance, and to be honest, the short, heavy imp intimidated me. Once everything was hung up, I padded barefoot to the fireplace and knelt. The wood basket was full of nearly dry wood and a bundle of tinder branches. Nothing was bone dry at this time of year, but the soft straw and curled bark would catch to a strong enough spark. I was so busy rummaging for my striker that I didn't hear Beech hop down from the bed and come up behind me. I started at the touch of his ice-cold hand against my bare shoulder. "Beech!" I gasped, and angrily shrugged him off. "Your hands are freezing. What do you want?" I glared at him, but swiftly looked away. He was totally naked, standing unabashed behind me. "Need a light?" He grinned at me over his freshly lit pipe and held out my striker. I grabbed it from him, averting my eyes with a blush, and began nursing the fire into life. Beech crouched down on the firestones next to me, cupping his pipe in his cold hands. It looked comically large for his small mouth, out of place. I had been given the thing many years ago by my father. I had never enjoyed the bitter taste of smoke, so I had been happy to let the imp have it. "You blush like a nervous lover," chuckled Beech. "Do I really unnerve you that much?" I grunted, non-committal, blowing gently on the infant fire. I wished I could grow a beard to hide my expressive cheeks, but the men in my family had a history of pink skin and nothing more than soft, short, downy blonde hair to cover our chins and chests. I would sooner grow apples in a garden of sand than a beard on my face. Beach's sarcastic jibes continued as I coaxed the damp wood into life, steaming away the surface water and filling the cold room with glow and warmth. In a now much warmer room, Beach and I sat side by side in front of the fire, Beach smoking like a chimney, while I watched the fire glow and die with each new log I tossed on. He had stopped talking some hours ago as the room warmed, and we let the night tick by in silence. The clothes that hung over the railing steamed, and a thin breeze drew out the damp through a half-open window. They would be dry by the morning. I stared into the fire, stretching out my sore feet and hands to warm them, while Beach remained crouched next to me, puffing away, his hands still clutching the warm pipe. The only movements, the coiling smoke that rose from the pipe, the flicker of motion from each new log I tossed on the fire, and the occasional shower of sparks that fled up the chimney. I wiggled my bare toes and winced at the sharp pain. We had been walking for several days, in an effort to cross a boggy marshland all in one go, rather than go round. No one wanted to lay down to sleep in 6 inches of waterlogged mud that spanned miles, so we had trudged on, like death's wanderlings. My feet had been constantly wet and walked on for more days than I felt like counting, and it was with a great deal of trepidation that I finally drew them one at a time into my lap to inspect the damage. Both feet were covered with blistering sores that sank deeply into my skin. The tops of my feet had somehow escaped the damage, but the bottoms and the backs of my heels had been worn and broken. I winced at the sight, and became aware of quite how much they hurt, despite not realizing it before. Not only that, but they were very, very dirty. Mud and grit had worked its way into every blister and sore, each scab and weeping wound drying over the filth of marsh water and decaying leaves. I glanced around the room and caught sight of a basin on a stand in the corner, and above it a fancy indoor pump. I stood with a whimper, limped over and began to pump water to wash my feet. Beach looked up with a start as I rose. He had been deep in thought, and followed my journey with piercing orange eyes. He watched with an expression I could not discern, his shockingly orange eyes seemingly spilling out the light from the fire they had been staring at all this time. I made my way back slowly, feeling tears of pain prickling my eyes with each step. With a grunt of effort, I hung the basin from a metal rung above the fire to warm the water before I used it to wash my feet. I hate to say it, but by the time this is finished, I shall owe you my life tenfold, Beach whispered, staring at my feet. I smiled, dripping a clean cloth into the water and testing the temperature. Perhaps I can have some of your impish magic for my trouble, I joked. Beach looked away, his cheeks colouring for a change. You know my magic is stifled in these lands. I only said it so you would help me. I know, I replied softly, stirring the warming water with my hand. I had realised quite quickly that Beach had none of the imp magic he so claimed. I had thought then of leaving him, the short, illegal imp man, to fend for himself and inevitably get arrested or killed. I couldn't have told him, or even myself, why I hadn't. I reached for my bag and rifled through it once again, this time on the hunt for the last remnants of a healing salve I had carried with me, and some strips of cloth I had been holding onto in case I needed to fix my clothes or sew shut a tear in my bag. They would work fine as bandages. When the water was just on the cusp of being too hot to take on my bare skin, I unhooked it and placed it on the flagstones. It was agony, the first time I forced myself to dip my injured feet into the hot water. The pain made my toes curl, and wisps of mud and blood seemed to curdle in the water. I avoided Beech's eyes as tears filled mine, and I forced myself to rub hard at each sore and blister till it was starkly clean. I let them dry in the warm glow of the fire, then spread a thin layer of the sweet-smelling, sage-green salve over each sore, revelling in the soothing coolness it brought after the heat and stinging cleanse of the hot water. I bandaged them as tightly as I could, and only then did I feel the waves of long-needed sleep begin to overwhelm me. "Take the bed," muttered Beech. "I have no sleep left in me." He remained where he was, crouched in only his skin, and stuffed yet more leaf into his pipe. It burned into a thick smoke that made a hovering haze in the upper portion of the room. Fingers of smoke reached down, and my progress from the fire to the bed made eddies that curled like the underside of an ocean. I flopped onto the bed and watched the haze above me through heavy-lidded eyes. As Beech continued to puff, it lowered, drifting closer and closer, enveloping the drying clothes and mixing with the steam that drifted up from them. Both smoke and steam fled the room through the half-open window and coiled into the damp air outside. Despite the open window, the warm room continued to fill with the heady smell of Beech's pipe, and the layer of smoke descended further still, till it drifted only an inch or so from my closing eyes. With every outward breath, I made a plume of clear air that punched through the brooding cloud of smoke, that filled in again, as though it had never existed. I watched the patterns and eddies before me until I fell asleep, the heady aroma enough to send me far into my mind and its dreams. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. If you are about to fall asleep, or have already dropped off, dream well. I hope you have a lovely night.